I think he got agented, as we say. Mike Tannenbaum, when he was out of football, was Dirk Cutter's agent, and I think the indication from Tampa was that he was going to interview in Miami and had a really, really good shot to get the head coaching job there. And when it came to what they're trying to accomplish, and remember, that team has Jameis Winston, and it's all aboard that train because they have to move forward and try to maximize the potential of Jameis Winston at all costs. And the worst thing you want to do with a young quarterback is have the second offensive coordinator in 2 years. And I don't think they thought Lovie Smith was the answer long-term anyway. So when push came to shove, they said, we'd rather have Dirk Cutter than Lovie Smith. And I think he's eventually going to be the head coach there.
Yeah, it seems that way, John. What about Lovie? What's his future? Is he a guy who's done with football? Is he a defensive coordinator? Is that a step too low for him? What is the future of a guy who's been to a Super Bowl for Lovie Smith?
I don't think he would go back to being a defensive coordinator. He's well-liked in the league. His players like him. It's not like a Chip Kelly scenario by any stretch of the imagination, but on one hand, as far as personality goes, on the other hand, he's similar to Chip in that he really just won't move away from the system. And I think a lot of people in this league look at the Tampa 2 as a base defense as being antiquated in today's environment, which the rules have made it difficult to play that defense and difficult to play coverage. That's just the reality of the situation. And he keeps wanting to play it. And if you look at what happened in Tampa Bay, they have some talent on that defense, but especially against opposing quarterbacks, the passer rating's over 100, the completion percentage is over 70% that they allow. You just can't play that defense consistently in 2015, 2016, and it keeps wanting to play it. So I don't know too many people that are going to wake up and say, ooh, I want to play that defense. I want to get Lovie Smith.
Yeah. John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. Adam Gase, so he was supposed to be back in Philly. Now he's not coming back to Philly. The Dolphins don't want him to get back to Philly, which is odd if he wasn't scheduled to be back here. So what is going to happen with Adam Gase over the next couple of days?
Well, I think there's a little misinformation as far as the interview and the schedule. The Eagles want to talk to him. There's just not a date set up yet. And that's where the indication from Miami has been that they want to get something done before he can get back to Philadelphia. So it's not like I don't think the Eagles' interest in him has wavered. I think they've learned from 2013. If you think about that coaching search, and it was pretty clear they wanted Chip Kelly immediately, and Chip Kelly turned him down originally, said he was going back to Oregon, and all of a sudden the Eagles had to reboot things and try to go in a different direction, and he eventually changed his mind. So I think now Philadelphia's mentality is to finish the first round of interviews and then go from there. I still think Adam Gase is the number one contender, but obviously there's danger in doing that. And somebody else could sneak in and make a better offer. Look better to them, and we talked about Miami a little bit yesterday. Certainly the location, certainly there's some monetary things that enter into it that are more favorable in Florida. So there is some danger, and if that comes to pass and the Dolphins get him, all of a sudden you have to look in a different direction. And I think that's where Doug Peterson comes in. Yeah,
I was going to follow up with Peterson because he seems like a kind of a stroll down memory lane kind of guy. It's almost like, hey, your father coached here, now we're going to hire your son 10 years later. Doug Peterson seems like, hey, Andy, we miss you. Let's bring back that Andy Reid feel.
Oh, there's no question. That's exactly what it would be. It would say Back to the Future. It's basically what it is. They want to recreate the environment, recreate the Reid regime, just with a younger guy who can be here for another 14 years.
So does that put him then at the top of the list?
I think, that's the way the Eagles will spin it if they go in that direction. But that's what you always hear. A lot of teams don't get their first choice, and then when you get whoever you hire, you have to spin it the best way possible, and I think certainly that's the tack that Philadelphia will take if that's the eventual end game. But I don't think he's at the top of the list. It's very telling when somebody gets a first interview. And Adam Gase got the first real interview. Obviously, Deuce Staley was talked to, Pat Shurmur was talked to. But in Philadelphia, Adam Gase got the first real interview. In Cleveland, he got the first real interview. And in Miami, even though he didn't get the first real interview, that's because the Eagles fired their coach early and they couldn't get the first interview with him. So all three of those organizations wanted to bring him in first. Now, that's not an indication. Somebody could do very, very poorly in an interview and trip up that way. There's a number of things that can go wrong. But when somebody goes out of their way to make you the first choice to talk about this job, and they talk to you for 8 hours, and they talk about a second interview, there's significant interest there.
John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. So Doug Peterson, we'll see. Ben McAdoo in today. Now, we talked a little bit about him yesterday. We haven't heard much of the follow-up, almost like nothing. Like he was just here because. We were bored today, so let's pick your brain. So is McAdoo just basically I don't want to say a courtesy, but why is he here?
Well, I think he's there. He realizes he's not in the top tier of candidates, but this is the first go-around where he's had interviews. So the more your name is out there, the more it helps you down the road.
So he pushes for this interview?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, certainly his agent. Next year you're going to see if Ben McAdoo doesn't get the Giants job. I don't think he's going to be a head coach in this league at any other city this year. But all of a sudden, because he gets interviews, next year's hiring cycle, there could be significantly more interest, especially if the Giants have a better year. So, that's part of it. Certainly the side of the agent and side of the potential coach, they want to get their name out there. And that's, we always talk about that aspect of it from the Rooney Rule and getting minorities' names out there. The same is true with guys who haven't had head coaching interviews before. And that's where Ben McAdoo is.
Who's more of a legitimate candidate, Peterson or Shurmur?
I would say Peterson. Even though we talked about it, the politics are real. And I understand people. I think we talked about it with Mike Sealski when we did the show on Tuesday, and they don't want to admit it's real. And certain, there's no doubt that Jeffrey Lurie and Howard Roseman and Don Smolinski should not take into account how it plays to the fan base. If they think a guy is the right guy, they should hire him. But that's not reality. And coming off this season and coming off how badly it went with Chip Kelly, it's a tough sell to go back in there and say Pat Shurmur is going to be the head coach. I think it remains a fail-safe if everything else doesn't work out. But it's just very, very difficult to sell, and that's a real part of this.
Paul Guenther is also going to be in here for an interview. He's a defensive-minded guy. Would you call him a dark horse?
I would. He's a Pennsylvania guy. Went to college at Ursinus, I believe. So he would have a lot of interest in the job. No, and think about. A lot of people, rip on Marvin Lewis because he hasn't won a playoff game, and hopefully he gets that done Saturday. But if you think about his tree and how it's developing, and Mike Zimmer in Minnesota, Jay Gruden in Washington, and all of a sudden Hugh Jackson's a hot candidate, and so is Paul Guenther. They got something going on in Cincinnati, and they do things the right way. And it's Zimmer's defense first and foremost, but Guenther learned it well. And the Bengals led this league in points allowed and gave up the least points. And that's how you have to play defense in today's NFL. You see Cincinnati, how well they do it. You see Minnesota, how well they do it. And I think the same situation could come to fruition in Philadelphia. Unfortunately for these fans, yeah. I think they're going to go offense.
Well, and then you wonder, if they go defense, does Shermer stay and play? I mean, is that something that would be an attractive situation to Jeffrey Lurie and Howie Roseman? It seemed like that would be a way that if you don't want Shermer to be your head coach because of what you said, the politics, why not go the other route? Because it seems like the fan base would be okay with Shermer staying on. They just don't want him to be the coach.
Yeah, I think it would be a great idea. Where it gets sticky, though, is that, as I said, when you hire a head coach, you don't want to force anybody upon him. Now, if Paul Guenther comes in and says, yeah, I like Pat Shermer, then it's no issue. But if he's got a guy in mind and all of a sudden you say, no, he can't be your offensive coordinator, you have to go with Pat Shermer, I think that kind of thing doesn't work, and you have to be very, very careful with that. So there's some hurdles you got to overcome. But, yeah, on paper it sounds great because there's not a lot of options at quarterback we talked about to basically re-sign Sam Bradford or draft somebody. And if you draft somebody in this particular draft, you kind of know you're setting yourself back 2 or 3 years because it's going to be a while. Not to say that some of these guys with first-round grades can't be star quarterbacks down the road, but they're a long way off from somebody like Jameis Winston, for instance, who finished 6-10, or even Marcus Mariota. And look at the Titans; they have the number 1 pick this year after having the number 2 pick last year. So there's going to be some struggles if you go down that road.
How much, when you're Howie Roseman and Jeffrey Lurie and you're interviewing these guys, how much is it Howie is your boss? Can you deal with that? 1, and 2, who is your coordinators? How much does that play when you're interviewing for a job?
Oh, huge. Your coordinators are a big part of it, and that's the whole thing. When you go into these interviews, and we talk about an 8-hour interview for Adam Gase, he laid out everything.
Yeah.
He laid out his coaching staff of what it's going to be. He laid out how he's going to handle the practice schedule, how the OTAs are going to run, how the mini camps. That's part of it, and that's the reason why it's so important to get interviews. Maybe, as we talked about with Ben McAdoo, maybe it's not going to come to fruition this year, but you kind of understand what you got to bring to the table the next time. Gase has already been through it. He almost got the San Francisco job last year, didn't get it because, we just talked about putting Pat Shermer as the offensive coordinator for Paul Guenther. Well, he turned down the San Francisco job because he didn't want to make Jim Tomsulo the defensive coordinator, and then the 49ers hired him. So that's the kind of travails you can have if you want to force coordinators on particular head coaching candidates.
John McMullen's with us. I want to ask you, we talked about this last hour. Going back to Chip Kelly not being here anymore. We talked about this on Tuesday. Is he a better candidate than some of the guys you're interviewing? And when push comes to shove, you look at what happened last night. Lovie Smith is fired because they didn't want to lose Dirk Cotter, right? I mean, virtually they didn't want to lose Dirk, so they fired Lovie. Is that a similar situation in Philly where Jeffrey didn't want to lose Howie, so he fired Chip?
Yeah, I mean, it's clear he chose Howie at the end over Chip. We all thought it was the other way around back last January. And this January, he pressed the rewind button. So there's no question about it. And the fact that he didn't take accountability for his own actions, I think that insulted Jeffrey Lurie. I think that upset him. I think that was a large part of it. But there's nobody Lurie trusts more in that building than Howie Roseman. And to this point, I don't know if that's good or bad.
Well, okay, I would ask you this then, John. So I believe Kelly and Roseman had a rift. They couldn't pair it up. And basically, hey, it's either you're working with Roseman or you're not. Well, I'm not. All right, you're gone. So my question really is, does Roseman get stereotyped? Do people not respect him because he's a nerdy, white guy?
Not because he's a nerdy white guy, but he is disrespected because he's not a traditional football guy.
Right, because so many guys there's been so many people that have been reported that can't get along with him, and I wonder if they prejudge him before they work with him and say, I don't respect this guy just because of his appearance or his look. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, there's no doubt, and part of it is, and it's interesting because Chip Kelly himself was prejudged by a lot of NFL people who said that nonsense can't work in this league, and the old boys network, blah blah blah. You can't run that junk and all that thing. It's college this, college Charlie. So it's interesting that a guy who went through that did the same thing to Howie Roseman because he's not, quote, a traditional football guy. And he's not. There's very few people in this world that start as a numbers guy and all of a sudden are in control of 53-man rosters in the NFL. There's Howie Roseman and there's Saucy Brown now in Cleveland, who went about it sort of the same way. He's a lawyer, and he's an analytics guy and a money guy, and all of a sudden he's in charge. So other than those two guys, it just doesn't happen all that often. Now, he has enough. We've seen enough. He has a big enough sample size, Howie Roseman, I'm saying. He's been a better personnel guy than Chip Kelly. There's no question about it. Chip did a bad job at that aspect of it. Now, that's not to say Howie's done a great job, because he hasn't. And I don't know if he's good enough. He's just better at that job than Chip Kelly is. And I wrote about it back in last January. The day we talked about it on the radio, the day it happened, I said that was the beginning of the end for Chip Kelly. And it's not because I'm trying to toot my own horn. It's just nobody can do both of those jobs unless they trust the people they're delegating to. And Chip Kelly wasn't wise enough to do that.
John, do you find it interesting that people like Adam Gase, because he resurrected or fixed or tweaked or whatevered Jay Cutler, and Chip Kelly got Nick Foles to win 10 games in this league? Do you find some irony in that?
A little bit. I mean, I think people the flavor of the month, and it was Chip Kelly back in 2013, and it's Adam Gase now. I mean, they almost can't live up to the expectations. I know that going in. I mean, you can talk about Jay Cutler cutting down interceptions, but this is a guy who's had better seasons. He won 10, 11 games in Chicago, and they were a last-place team this time around. So I don't know where everyone is saying that this is the best he's ever played because he's cut down on his interceptions. I don't necessarily agree with that. Number one, and we always talk about his work in Denver. If you're the offensive coordinator of Peyton Manning, I got news for you. Peyton Manning's the real offensive coordinator, and that was the case with Adam Gase in Denver. So, I said it with the Eagles. I say it with the Dolphins. Wherever he ends up, buyer beware. You got to be very, very, very sure. I'm glad the Eagles didn't jump the gun, and I thought they would. I'm glad they're doing their due diligence because I'm not completely sold on a 37-year-old guy being the next head coach of this team.
And we talked to John Mullen earlier, not John McMullen, but John Mullen earlier out in Chicago, and he questioned that as well. He said he wasn't sure that he was ready. Smart guy, good guy. He seemed to indicate that I'm not sure that he's ready to run the whole team. He was the head coach of the offense out there, but is he capable and ready to run the whole thing? And I think that's kind of telling. He also kind of indicated that he's a very family guy. He's not just going to take a job just to be promoted. It's got to be the right job. And is Philadelphia the right move for him? That'll be interesting to see. As you talked about Miami, the city, that seems like with a guy like him that does play a factor.
Yeah, it always can. Miami has a big advantage on getting free agents, getting coaches. They always do. And some of that they've shot themselves in the foot over the years for this dysfunction. But anytime people have a chance to go live in South Florida and live in that environment, it's tough to compete with that. And the one thing the past has been a good, stable organization, but that reputation has been blown up over the past few years because there has been significant dysfunction in that front office that is every bit as bad as anything that's going on in Cleveland, anything that's going on in Miami, anything that's going on in San Francisco. It's been every bit as bad and the Eagles have to stop the bleeding and get sort of that gold standard reputation that everyone laughs at when Jeffrey Lurie said that. But at least as far as how they run their operation, they were at one time very highly regarded in the NFL. That's no longer the case.
Good stuff, John. John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. He's got a story up right now that the Eagles, they will do their due diligence. They're not going to jump on the flavor of the week, it looks like. So good job out of them. And, of course, tomorrow we'll take a look at the games. There's games to be played this weekend. You can hear them all right here on 97.3 ESPN. Thanks, John.
Hey, thanks, Mike.